The morning it happened, I was sipping coffee, walking out to fill the cattle trough like I had every day since I came back to Dry Valley. I turned the spigot, it hissed dry, no pressure, no water, just dust. I didn't need a second guess who was behind it. She showed up not a minute later, Cynthia Holbrook, president of the Desert Glades Property Council, all smug smiles and clipboard confidence. "You've violated irrigation restrictions," she said. "Your water privileges are suspended, effective immediately." She thought she was delivering some kind of royal decree. What Cynthia didn't know, what no one on her freshly paved cul-de-sac knew, was that the water she thought she controlled, it didn't come from the town supply, it didn't come from her bylaws. It came from the dam my grandfather built in 1946, on land my family has held since before Arizona had highways. She shut off a tap, but I held the source, and if I turned that valve, her whole HOA would go dry. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a mistake, and it was about to cost her everything. When I left Dry Valley at 18, I swore I'd never come back. The sun was too cruel, the dust too thick, and the silence too loud for a restless kid like me. So I chased noise. I joined the Army Corps of Engineers, served my years in concrete and steel, built levees and bridges in places where rivers tried to eat towns whole. But after 3 decades and one worn-out back, I came back home. Not to start over, just to finish what my grandfather began. The land I returned to wasn't some cute ranch. It was hard ground, bone-dry most years and flooded the rest. Tumbleweeds rolled through fences, and coyotes still sang like mourners at night. But to me it was sacred, because under that crusted soil sat something more precious than gold in Arizona: water. My grandfather, Will Callahan, built a dam by hand in 1946 with a team of 3 men and a borrowed Caterpillar. He dug a reservoir into the hill's belly and redirected runoff from 2 desert gullies. By the time I was old enough to walk, he'd already taught me how to read the levels, patch the spillway, and count the seconds it took the trough to fill after opening the gate. The dam wasn't just infrastructure, it was family memory poured in concrete. My father died young. My grandfather raised me until I left for the Army. And that dam? That was his heartbeat. Every stone he laid had a purpose. Every inch of that earth was graded with an engineer's eye and a grandfather's love. He didn't just irrigate fields, he carved permanence into a landscape that tried to forget people ever lived there. The house itself had weathered poorly, cracked walls, warped floors, rusted hinges that groaned when the wind shifted. But the dam, still solid, still feeding the cattle trough, still holding the valley together like an old man's handshake. I spent the first few weeks patching fences and walking the levees every morning, with a thermos of black coffee in one hand and my grandfather's journal in the other. He had diagrams for every pipe, notations on seepage rates, even pencil sketches of sediment drift from the spring floods of... The man was obsessive, but methodical. That's why it still held. I planted a few mesquite trees, repaired the barn roof, got to know the wind again. It had changed directions slightly over the years. Used to roll in from the west, now came whispering out of the northeast. But the air still carried that cracked earth scent right before rain. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. In the evenings down by the southern fence line, I could see porch lights twinkling from a new housing development that hadn't existed when I left. Big homes, synthetic lawns, driveways like runway, and satellite dishes pointed skyward like prayer. I knew what it meant. Subdivisions didn't pop up in places like Dry Valley unless someone had promised water. Lots of it, year-round, and there was only one source of water for miles, in any direction. Mine. Still, I stayed quiet. I figured they'd made a deal with the county, tapped a pipeline, maybe sunk a municipal well. People were clever that way. And besides, I wasn't here to pick fights. I was here to finish a legacy. Each morning I'd wake early, walk the reservoir, and tip my hat to Will Callahan's dam like a soldier reporting for duty. Then I'd sit on the porch, drink my coffee, and listen to the hum of a world that hadn't quite realized it was dependent on one old man and one older blueprint. This land wasn't scenery, it was family history written in water. The first time I heard the term Desert Glades Property Council, I figured it was a landscaping company. It wasn't. It was an HOA, a big one. The kind with matching signs, newsletters in plastic sleeves, and an attitude that screamed polished teeth and Pinterest regulation. The subdivision had taken root just south of my land, one of those planned communities where every house has a sunroom, every driveway a smart gate, and every lawn a suspiciously vibrant green, despite the desert trying to kill everything. I had no quarrel with their turf, until they came for mine. It started small. A man in a polo shirt and expensive sunglasses walked up one afternoon while I was mending a fence. Said his name was Darren, introduced himself as vice chair of community harmony. That should have been my first clue. He handed me a glossy folder full of documents titled Desert Glades Community Living Standards. Inside were pages of codes, restrictions, font sizes, even acceptable mailbox colors. And at the bottom, highlighted in cheerful blue, water access and usage guidelines, section. I told him I didn't live in Desert Glades. He smiled, like that didn't matter. We're expanding jurisdiction to encompass neighboring parcels with shared water access, he said, like it was a done deal. It's more efficient for regional management. I didn't say much, just flipped the folder shut and handed it back. A few days later, they sent more. 3 people this time, all dressed like realtors. Middle-aged, manicured, and moving like they owned air rights. One of them was Cynthia Holbrook, president of the HOA, I'd later learn, but she introduced herself as chair of Watershed Oversight. She didn't shake hands. Mr. Callahan, she said, glancing at her clipboard like it was a warrant. We've received reports that your irrigation system is operating outside community timing windows. You're using water during off-peak hours. I blinked. This land isn't part of your community. She gave a tight smile, but the water flows through shared terrain, and if it affects our common use retention basins, it falls under our management. Behind her, the others nodded like backup dancers. One held a laminated map showing my dam and reservoir, drawn with dotted lines suggesting it was part of their environmental buffer zone. That's when I realized they didn't just think they could regulate me, they thought they owned the water. I told them plainly, that dam was built in '46, it sits on private land. I've got priority rights on file with the state and a permit renewal stamped last year. You don't own a drop. Cynthia didn't flinch. We'll need to see documentation. Until then, we're issuing a notice of concern. She handed me a bright yellow envelope with a smiling sun logo on the seal. Inside, a typed violation for unauthorized landscape runoff and a warning about non-compliant drought behavior. I didn't even respond. I just walked past them, turned the valve on my trough line, and let water flow loud enough for all of them to hear. She raised her voice. This isn't personal, Mr. Callahan. It's about preserving community standards. No, I said, not turning around. It's about jurisdiction, and you don't have any. That night, I pulled out my grandfather's paperwork, just to be sure. The dam's water rights were registered under riparian principles, meaning my land had direct access and legal use of the water by proximity and historical claim. The HOA, on the other hand, was built decades later, using municipal lines and temporary downstream licenses. They didn't understand the difference between owning a view and owning a source. They confused aesthetics with authority. So I drafted a letter, simple, formal, and certified. Included copies of the original deed, the Bureau of Reclamation permit numbers, and a highlighted section of Arizona's revised statutes on surface water rights. The next time they came by, 2 SUVs idling on the curb like enforcement wagons. I didn't answer the door, I didn't need to, I had already sent my message. They thought I was some old man with a hose. They were about to learn I was the legal guardian of every drop beneath their feet. When you grow up on land that barely forgives you for existing, you learn that water is memory. Not just survival, memory. Every drop stored, measured, moved, and accounted for. My grandfather knew this. That's why he documented everything. I pulled down the old metal file cabinet from the loft above the workshop. It smelled like dust, grease, and old tobacco. Inside, blueprints, letters, permits, maps with ink faded to a whisper. These weren't just papers, they were anchors, locking our claim in law and time. In 1946, he upgraded the property to include riparian infrastructure, filing under the state's Surface Water Use Act. 2 years later, the Army Corps of Engineers signed off on the dam's flood retention design. I found that permit too, yellowed, brittle, but legible. My name was already penciled into the succession clause, future custodian Franklin Callahan. I found a hand-drawn cross-section of the dam from 1952, his handwriting in the margin. When others forget where water comes from, remind them. He knew this day would come, but it was the 1987 letter that sealed it, a stamped agreement between Will and the now-defunct Dry Valley Cattlemen's Association. It detailed exclusive water rights, reinforced by a formal survey and notarized boundary descriptions. The HOA's tract, it didn't even exist then. Their homes were built on what used to be dry grazing hills. They had no riparian claim, no shoreline easement, no foundational water access. What they had was landscaping dreams built on municipal dependency. And I held the switch. I made copies of everything, labeled them with sticky notes, sent certified packets to the county recorder's office, the Arizona Department of Water Resources, and my attorney, a quiet old friend named Marshall who still wore cowboy boots to court. That's when the HOA struck first. I came home one afternoon to find a pink slip hanging from my gate. Notice of violation, unauthorized water storage and outflow. The return address? Not the city, not the county. It was the Desert Glades Property Council. They had drafted their own citation, complete with a fake seal and a barcode that led to nothing. The envelope included a bill, a fine actually for non-compliant reservoir management in the amount of $2,500, due in 10 days. And if unpaid, escalation to municipal collections. I sat down on my porch with that notice in hand and just laughed. They were bluffing, but it was more than that, it was dangerous ignorance dressed up in authority. So I filed a counteraction. Not through lawyers, not yet. I started by submitting an affidavit of water right continuity with the State Water Office, publicly reinforcing my family's registered claim. Then I filed a cease and desist letter to the HOA's legal desk, citing violations of Title 45 of Arizona's revised statutes. But I didn't stop there. I submitted a complaint with the county's Environmental Services Department, including evidence that the HOA had improperly diverted storm runoff through newly paved streets without proper drainage clearance, pushing silt directly into Dry Creek Wash where it risked breaching the edges of my reservoir. That complaint? It triggered an inspection. Cynthia Holbrook called me the next morning, left a message. Her voice sounded tighter than usual. "We believe there's been a misunderstanding. Let's discuss this neighbor to neighbor." I didn't return the call, because by now it wasn't about misunderstanding, it was about exposure. They wanted control without consequence. But water doesn't play politics, it flows according to gravity and law. And gravity in this valley still ran through my dam. They didn't like being ignored. After I filed that cease and desist and alerted the county, the Desert Glades Property Council escalated in their favorite way, passive aggression wrapped in paperwork. 3 days later, a white pickup with a magnetic seal reading County Code Enforcement pulled into my drive. A younger man stepped out, khakis tucked into scuffed boots, holding a clipboard like a badge. "Mr. Callahan, I'm here about a report of unauthorized dam modifications and unpermitted water retention." I gestured toward the porch. "You want coffee before or after you get embarrassed?" To his credit, he chuckled. "Let's walk first." We made the loop from the main gate to the dam face along the spillway channel, down past the cattle troughs, and up again along the old levee line. I showed him the original survey markers, handed him a laminated copy of my grandfather's Corps of Engineers permit. He stared at it longer than I expected. "This is really well documented," he muttered. I nodded. "Every inch." He took pictures anyway, standard procedure, but he stopped about halfway through and said, "I'm going to be honest. I don't think you're the one with a compliance issue here." He was right, because when he inspected the HOA's side, their so-called drainage improvements and recreational overflow canal, he found multiple unpermitted structures. Their new concrete trench cut across a native arroyo, redirecting runoff directly toward my fencing. No erosion control, no permits on file. The county's report came in 5 days later. I got a copy in the mail. Findings: no violations present on Callahan property. Recommendations: further inquiry into Desert Glades HOA grading activities. The first shot had been fired and missed. Cynthia Holbrook didn't like that. Next came the letters. She sent one with each passing week: formal complaints, legal threats, even an attempt to invoice me for uncollected infrastructure dues. Each one more ridiculous than the last. My favorite was the envelope labeled retroactive membership compliant. It claimed I owed the HOA 3 years' worth of fees for waterway adjacency. 3 years, despite never signing, joining, or consenting to anything. I mailed it back with a note: respectfully declined. Water flows downhill, not authority. Still, I knew better than to laugh too loud. People like Cynthia don't stop when they're wrong, they double down. I started documenting everything. Every visit, every letter, every car that lingered too long at the edge of my road. I logged license plates, timestamps, even drone sightings. Yes, drones. One morning I caught a quadcopter hovering above the dam. I followed its signal and traced it to a realtor's office registered to a Desert Glades board member. They were watching me, measuring, trying to find weakness. But the thing about engineers is, we build for failure. Every inch of that dam had redundancy, just like I did. I called Marshall, my attorney, and we preemptively filed a restraining notice, not against a person, but against any unauthorized monitoring or documentation of private water infrastructure. That got the drones to stop. The neighbors, though, they didn't know what to think. Some looked at me like a relic. Others started waving from their yards. One even crossed the boundary fence to shake my hand and say, "Don't let them push you, old man, we're watching." And that's when the mood started to shift. But now the county knew the HOA was meddling. My neighbors were questioning their dues, and the board. Then came the public meeting. I didn't plan to go, but when the agenda listed water regulation discussion external parcels, I showed up in full. The room was a sea of beige cardigans and furrowed brows. Cynthia stood at the podium with her perfect posture and her stack of bullet point printouts. Then I raised my hand. "Ma'am," I said, "do you have a hydrological map that proves your right to regulate outside your subdivision?" Silence. "I have 4 government documents proving mine. Want copies?" Murmurs, shifting seats. Cynthia tried to redirect. "This isn't about ownership." "But it is," I said. "You can't regulate what you don't own, and you can't bill what you never built." The room turned. Not completely, but I walked out before the meeting ended, left them to their whispers. I'd planted the seed. Now all I had to do was wait for the cracks to show. The envelope was cream-colored this time, with gold trim along the edge. Fancy, like a wedding invitation or a country club fundraiser. Inside, a new line item titled Lakeside Utility Stabilization Levy. Translation: a tax on water. More specifically, a mandatory quarterly fee for all properties with visual or physical access to the community's shared water features. Amount due $1,350, due date. And just beneath that, in tiny print, includes Dry Valley Dam resource surcharge. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping black coffee and reading it 3 times over. Not out of confusion, I understood exactly what it was. They were charging me for my own water, on paper, with signature. I whistled low and slow. "You finally did it, Cynthia," I said out loud. "You declared war." This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was fabrication, deliberate, calculated, and now fraudulent. So I called Marshall. He came by that afternoon, hat in hand, boots dusty, and briefcase full of legal hellfire. We sat under the porch fan while he read the document word by word, mouth twitching with every clause. "That they're charging you for the dam?" "Yup. Which you built." "My grandfather built?" "Which they don't own." "Correct." He leaned back and exhaled. "We can file this 6 different ways: fraud, misrepresentation, unauthorized taxation, violation of Arizona water rights, statute Title 45, maybe even mail fraud if they sent this to others." "Oh, they did?" I said, handing him a second letter addressed to one of my neighbors. 3 properties along the boundary line." Marshall nodded. "Then it's systemic." I smiled. "Let's make it educational." We started drafting. First, a formal refusal of fraudulent levy, referencing the 1946 dam permit, the 1987 dry easement contract, and the updated 2020 certification of riparian use filed under my name. Second, a letter to the State Water Rights Division attaching both HOA documents and requesting formal investigation into unauthorized water fee collection on private riparian resource. Third, a letter to the Arizona Attorney General's office CCing the County Board of Supervisors and Environmental Regulation Agency. Not threats, not lawsuit, just evidence. Presented quietly, calmly, and in overwhelming detail. Because when you show up with emotion, they call you unstable. But when you show up with paperwork, they call you sir. 2 days later, Cynthia sent me an email. First time she'd used that method, subject line, seeking clarity on jurisdiction. No apology, just an invitation to cooperatively review boundaries for mutual benefit. Translation: she was nervous. That weekend, I hosted a cookout. Pulled the smoker out back, laid out brisket and sweet corn, invited the 3 neighbors who'd gotten the same levy notice. Word spread, and soon half the subdivision was on folding chairs in my pasture, plates full and questions buzzing. I stood on the bed of my pickup and told the truth. People nodded. Then, I explained riparian rights. Littoral law, the legal line between access and ownership, and why their lawns, pools, and sprinklers all relied on water that passed through infrastructure they didn't own, didn't maintain, and had no right to tax. I saw realization spread like wildfire. Later that night, one of the newer residents, young couple from Phoenix, came up to me and said, "We had no idea. They told us the HOA built the dam." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was textbook. They sell you scenery, then tax you for the illusion. The following week, the HOA board held a closed emergency session. Minutes weren't shared, but word leaked that 2 board members opposed Cynthia's tactics and walked out mid-meeting. The cracks were showing, but she wasn't done, because 2 days later I got served. A formal notice of non-compliance and escalating enforcement action. This one came with a courier, embossed seal, even a QR code. Fancy. It claimed that refusal to pay the levy constituted resource hoarding and cited a bylaw about shared community burdens. But here's the thing. That bylaw didn't apply to non-member parcels. I highlighted that clause in red ink, scanned it and sent it along with the full levy demand to the regional news station's local watchdog desk. Subject line, retired engineer fined for owning the water. I didn't wait to hear back. I knew it would land. Because if Cynthia wanted a war of words and documents, I had 100 years of history to throw back at her, line by notarized line. And she had nothing but a thirsty neighborhood and a file full of lies. It started with the hum of an engine. I was in the barn, checking pipe fittings, when I heard it, a low diesel rumble too slow for a truck, too loud for a mower. I stepped out and followed the sound past the cattle fence and up the ridge overlooking the dam. And there they were, 3 men in neon vests and hard hats, one holding a clipboard, another with a drill, the third standing way too close to the release valve. No call, no letter, no permission. I walked down the slope calm, camera phone already recording. When I got within 20 feet I called out, "Mind telling me what you're inspecting on land you don't own?" The one with the clipboard turned, surprised. "You must be Mr. Callahan. We're here on behalf of the Desert Glades HOA, routine water safety check." "Funny," I said, "because this dam isn't part of Desert Glades. Never has been. You boys have a permit?" They froze. I stepped closer, tapping my phone. "Just to be clear, you're currently inside private boundaries, as defined in the 1946 hydrological easement, and altering any water infrastructure without state clearance is a felony under Title. They didn't argue. They packed up fast, but not before I got every face, every plate number, and a photo of the drill marks they'd left in the concrete just below the runoff gauge. Back at the house, I sent everything, videos, photos, time-stamped location data, to the State Water Authority Compliance Division. I didn't frame it as a complaint. I framed it as an urgent inquiry into unauthorized dam access with potential implications under the Clean Water Act. That got their attention. The response came within 12 hours. A representative named Karen Revenges, hydrologist and field investigator, called directly. "I reviewed your report, Mr. Callahan," she said. "That's a pretty serious breach." I thought so. She asked for a site inspection. I said I'd be happy to walk her through every bolt of the infrastructure. 2 days later, she arrived in a dusty state truck with water quality meters, a drone case, and a look that said she didn't come for pleasantries. We spent 4 hours walking the entire system. She examined the release gates, measured sediment along the shoreline, tested spillway drainage, and photographed the marks left by the HOA's crew. When she reached the overflow channel, she stopped and said, "See that?" I looked where she pointed. Cracks, subtle but spreading, along the channel wall where runoff redirected near the HOA's new concrete slab. "That's not natural erosion," she said. "That's redirected stress. Someone tampered upstream." I nodded. "Their so-called overflow trench, built without a permit." Her eyes narrowed. "That's not just reckless. That's federal." She explained that any alteration to shared waterways that affect flow volume, retention, or downstream discharge, even if it starts on private land, must be disclosed under the Clean Water Act Section 404, and in some cases also requires Army Corps of Engineers sign-off. "They didn't file anything," I said, "because they think they own it all?" She raised a brow. "They're about to find out they don't." Before she left, she took one final look at the dam and said, "Your grandfather built this? 1946, with Corps approval. I've got the permits." She smiled. "Then he built it right, and you've done a hell of a job keeping it that way." By the end of the week, Cynthia Holbrook received a formal notice of violation from the State Water Authority, naming the Desert Glades Property Council as the subject of a pending review into unauthorized environmental activity, potential liability for downstream impact, and interference with a state-recognized dam structure. I heard about the board meeting through a neighbor. Cynthia tried to frame it as routine procedural clarification, but her voice cracked because she knew what was coming next. This wasn't just me anymore. This was a paper trail of unauthorized construction, environmental tampering, and possible violation of federal law. I wasn't alone. Now the state was watching, and beneath her expensive shoes and manicured lawns, her HOA was sitting on infrastructure they didn't own, they didn't understand, and that was beginning to crack. The envelope this time was hand-delivered. Not from the HOA, not from their lawyer, but from Cynthia Holbrook herself. She showed up at the gate like a polished ghost, silk blouse, mirrored sunglasses, and a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Callahan," she called sweetly, holding the manila folder out like a peace offering. "Let's not let paperwork ruin a beautiful neighborhood." I didn't take it. "What is it?" "An agreement," she said, stepping closer. "A quiet resolution. You transfer water rights to the HOA and we ensure you're compensated generously for your time, energy, and past investments." She meant the dam, the history, my inheritance. How generous. She smiled. 750,000, tax-sheltered, disbursed in 3 payments. Plus your name remains as honorary steward in the HOA literature. A legacy, Mr. Callahan. Strings? She handed me the folder, just a standard non-disclosure clause. Nothing unusual. I opened it, skimmed. Full transfer of riparian claim, exclusive access easement, and language prohibiting public commentary, media disclosures, or regulatory filings past and present. In other words, hush money. "No deal," I said. She didn't argue. She just paused, slid her sunglasses down, and said, "You might want to think it over. These kinds of things can get complicated." Then she walked back to her Lexus and drove off. That night my Google reviews started tanking. Callahan Repairs and Consulting, a quiet side gig I used for local metalwork, went from 5 stars to 2 in 12 hours. Suddenly I was hostile, unreliable, and dangerous around families. The photos used were doctored, comments from names that didn't exist. A week later, someone broke into the boathouse. Didn't steal anything, just left the workshop door swinging open and scattered my grandfather's rolled survey maps across the floor like garbage. Oil spilled across the corner, a clean no fingerprints, no cameras on that side of the property. But I took photos, filed a police report, and logged everything. Dates, times, prints, angles. Because by now, I wasn't angry, I was documenting. Next came the restraining order, filed by a concerned neighbor claiming I'd threatened violence with agricultural tools. I showed up to the hearing in a tie, carrying photos from the cookout I hosted that same night, 3 families on lawn chairs, kids playing by the pasture, timestamp texts. The judge dismissed it in 4 minutes. But the message was clear. Cynthia and her people weren't just coming for the dam. They were trying to break me. That's when I got a letter in the mail, this time unsigned, just a return address from a house I didn't recognize. Inside, a single page. "Keep fighting, you're not the only one they've tried to crush." Yo. I traced the address. It belonged to Lucas Ramirez, a local wetland biologist with the State Department of Environmental Quality. Turns out, Cynthia's HOA had tried to block one of his restoration projects a year earlier, claimed it infringed on aesthetics. I gave him a call. He said, "They tried to bury me in paperwork too. Didn't work. I've read your filings. You're doing everything right." I asked if he'd help me document potential downstream impact from the HOA's unauthorized shoreline trench. He didn't hesitate. Absolutely. A few days later, I ran into Judge Eleanor Keating at the feed store, retired Superior Court Justice, lived 2 plots over. She leaned on her cane and said, "Cynthia always did mistake HOA bylaws for real law." Then she winked and added, "If you need a witness to character, I still remember when you built my ramp for free after the monsoon storm." The final piece came from the Dry Valley Fishermen's Association. They'd caught wind of the shoreline modification and asked for a walkthrough. 4 of them showed up with clipboards, GoPros, and fishery impact maps. We hiked the dam edge, walked the trench, and they documented every destabilized silt runoff path. One of them, grizzled old guy named Benji, muttered, "Idiots like her think water flows by decree, but it doesn't care about fences." He spit in the dirt and added, "Tell us when it goes to court, we'll be there." By month's end, I had a growing coalition. A state biologist, a retired judge, a group of fishermen, and a paper trail thick enough to sink a boat. Meanwhile, Cynthia's empire was cracking. Board members started resigning, 2 citing ethical disagreements. Anonymous tips hit the county zoning office. Local media sniffed a story. And me? I kept filing, documenting, photographing. Because I didn't need to swing, I just needed to stand. And when you stand on truth, eventually the tide turns. Even in the desert, it started with a crack. Not the kind you hear, the kind you feel in your bones. Subtle, shifting, the way a slope gives underfoot or a plank flexes just wrong beneath your weight. I felt it one morning walking the eastern embankment, a tremor, a softness that wasn't there the week before. I crouched down, ran my hand through the soil, and saw it, fresh stress fractures radiating out like spider legs from the base of the HOA's trench work. They'd cut too close. Months earlier, their hired crew had carved a beautification runoff, an open trench from their tiered fountains down to the slope near the reservoir. They'd packed it with white river stones and called it a natural channel, but it wasn't natural, it was stupid. My grandfather had surveyed this entire ridge in 1948. I pulled out his old journal, the leather cracked pages yellowed but still legible. On page 17, he'd sketched the slope angles, marked the clay shelf beneath the topsoil, and drawn bold red X's over the exact area the HOA had disturbed. Underneath that sketch, he'd scrawled in thick pencil, "Do not alter primary stress zone. Flood risk." I compared his notes with my GPS overlay. They had dug directly into the shelf. That night I pored over his maps by lamplight. The dam itself was stable, reinforced. My own maintenance over the years had made sure of that. But erosion, that was a silent thief. And what the HOA had done without a single hydrological study or a drainage permit had turned the South Ridge into a ticking time bomb. See, when you straighten shorelines, you eliminate the natural curve that slows water. Rain accelerates, gravity pulls harder, and instead of absorbing into spongy soil, water starts behaving like a sledgehammer. Fast-moving runoff undercuts banks, it rips root systems, it eats from below. And with their trench feeding directly into that angle, the overflow wouldn't just trickle into the reservoir. It would collapse the shelf and potentially flood the retaining wall. I ran calculations. 3 inches of sustained rainfall across the HOA's artificial surfaces, roofs, sidewalks, driveways, would generate enough flow to exceed the trench's capacity by any more, and it would redirect down toward the dam. And fast. I contacted Lucas Ramirez, the state biologist. He brought a drone the next day. We flew it from the HOA's upper terrace all the way down the trench, watching the real-time overlay of grade slope and velocity predictions. His face went pale. "If we get spring storms," he said, "this trench becomes a river. And that river," I added, "hits the structural shelf." He nodded. "It won't take much." I filed an emergency report with the State Floodplain Division, including drone footage, grandfather's surveys, and my new calculations. It was flagged high priority. But bureaucracy moves like molasses, especially when politics and rich developers are involved. The HOA? Still smug. They were too busy holding ribbon cuttings for Desert Serenity Park, a space they built using reclaimed water systems right above the failing trench. I watched the coverage on the local news. Cynthia Holbrook grinned for the camera, saying, "Water is life, and here in Desert Glades we manage ours with pride and sustainability." I nearly threw my thermos. The final confirmation came from nature itself. Late March brought a freak heat wave, followed by a rare pressure drop, the kind that makes your knees ache and the birds vanish. I smelled rain in the air, thick and metallic. By the end of the week, meteorologists issued storm watches. 2 systems converging, one from the north, one from the Pacific. Forecast, 4 inches of rain in 36 hours. I stood on the dam wall that evening, wind whipping my collar, and stared down at the trench glowing faintly under the HOA's solar lights. It looked harmless, clean, controlled. But I knew better. Water doesn't care about appearances. It only cares about physics. And they had broken the balance. I spent the night sandbagging the secondary overflow valve. Not because I didn't trust my dam, because I didn't trust theirs. And as I worked, I thought about Will Callahan, about how he'd walk the perimeter every night with a lantern, listening for leaks the ear could catch before the eye could see. That man respected water like it was a living thing. Cynthia Holbrook? She treated it like a commodity, and that was going to cost her more than money. I emailed one final report, this time CCing the Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Environmental Quality, and a contact from FEMA floodplain mapping. Subject line: Authorize hydrological alteration with imminent failure risk, Dry Valley HOA. Attachments: drone footage, soil samples, 1946 engineering notes, rainfall projection. Then I hit send, because the time for warnings was over. Now came the test. Of concrete, of truth, of legacy. The rain didn't start with a whisper. It came like a drumline, pounding, insistent, rattling against my shop roof and battering the aluminum gate until the hinges moaned. I was already up, already dressed, boots laced tight and generator humming, scanning the radar feed on my laptop while a pot of coffee burned behind me. They said 4 inches. By dawn, we were already past 5. At 6:14 a.m., the first call came from a neighbor. "Frank, something's wrong. The HOA fountains are overflowing, and the trench, God, it's like a river." By 7:30, I was watching it from the ridge. The channel the HOA had dug was now a full-blown stream, gouging deeper, foaming with sediment and mulch, punching straight through their retaining wall and roaring down toward the basin. I had already opened the emergency floodgates on my dam, the ones my grandfather built by hand, brick by brick, with pressure valves calibrated for events exactly like this. But the HOA had no such controls. They didn't believe in contingency. They believed in appearances. And by 8:05 those appearances were gone. Cynthia Holbrook's prized Serenity Park was underwater. The walking path had split, decorative fountains were shattered. One of the HOA board members' driveways had collapsed into a sinkhole, an above-ground pool tipped sideways into a ravine like a teacup flung off a table. And the trench cracked at the slope. The slope tore loose. A slurry of water and topsoil crashed down the hill, breaching the edge of the lower HOA development. It missed my dam by 300 feet, but it hit them dead on. At 8:47 a.m., the county issued an emergency response alert. At 9:22, a news chopper was overhead, streaming the carnage live across the state. And yet, while the water surged, I was walking into a federal courtroom. See, the case had finally reached the bench. Months of filings, depositions, environmental reports, sworn testimony, all culminating in this. The courtroom was cold. Hardwood benches, a judge with tired eyes and a tight jaw. Cynthia was already seated at the table, flanked by her lawyer and one remaining board member. She wore white, too white, like she thought she was innocent. My lawyer, a former land use specialist named Calvin Brock, opened strong. Your Honor, we present documented evidence that the HOA's leadership knowingly interfered with an existing private water infrastructure, levied unauthorized penalties, engaged in harassment, and most critically altered hydrological terrain without permits, leading to direct environmental damage. He clicked the first slide. Drone footage, erosion patterns, GPS overlays, a side-by-side comparison of the slope 1 year ago versus now. Then I took the stand. I didn't speak with anger. I spoke with maps, with photographs, with my grandfather's field notes, laminated and marked in red. I read his words aloud. This slope is the key. Disturb it, and it all comes down. I showed time-stamped photos, receipts, engineering diagrams. I described Cynthia's attempt to bribe me into silence, her threats, the online smear campaign, the break-in. They didn't object. They knew it was all real. Then came the kicker. We played a recording, a captured phone call from a disgruntled ex-board member who'd reached out to me after resigning. I told her we couldn't keep pretending we had jurisdiction. She said, "We have optics, that's enough." In the silence that followed, I glanced at the courtroom screen behind me. A live feed was running. The news was still showing the flood. Helicopters, chaos, county trucks arriving. And in one wide shot, you could see it. A stream still cutting through the heart of the HOA development, now full of trash bins, broken lawn furniture, and hunks of decorative stone. When it was Cynthia's turn to testify, she walked to the stand like she was stepping into a photo op. But that poise didn't last. When the judge asked why permits were never filed for trench work, she fumbled. When asked why she signed notices threatening a private landowner without verifying legal boundaries, she stammered. And when Calvin calmly read aloud the NDA offer she hand-delivered, the one with full water rights transfer clauses, her hands trembled. "Did you write this?" It was a proposal. "Did you include a gag order?" It was standard. "Did you anticipate this flood?" Her voice cracked. No one could have. I stood. My grandfather did. The judge didn't take long. By 3:30 p.m., he read his ruling into the record. The HOA is hereby found guilty of environmental negligence, fraudulent misrepresentation, and unlawful harassment. The court orders the immediate termination of all HOA claims to the contested water infrastructure. Damages awarded to Mr. Callahan, including legal costs and restitution. Furthermore, the HOA must initiate full environmental remediation under state supervision. He paused, then added, "And for the record, water is not governed by assumption, it's governed by law." Outside the courthouse, I shook Calvin's hand. Across the street, reporters swarmed Cynthia's car. She didn't look at me, not once, but I didn't need her to. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoring what was true, what was right, what was mine, and always had been. The first fish returned 3 weeks after the trench was closed. Tiny silver flash, just beneath the surface. Maybe a trout, maybe a sunfish. I couldn't tell from the dock, but I saw it break the surface at dawn, right in the same cove where my grandfather used to cast with a hand-tied fly. It was the first sign. Water finds its rhythm when you let it. Restoration didn't start with ribbon cuttings or speeches. It started with shovels. Volunteers came from all corners of the valley, not just the old-timers or the ranchers, but young families, high school kids, veterans groups, local tribal water monitors. People I'd never met showed up with gloves and thermoses, asking what needed doing. We dismantled the HOA trench first, filled it in with native soil, reinforced the original grade with willow cuttings and stone berms. No more concrete vanity walls, just earth shaped by purpose. We walked the perimeter of the lake with survey markers flagging every dock that had been built illegally. Some of them we let stay, but only if the owners agreed to replant shoreline vegetation and fund fish habitat boxes. A new contract was drafted, this time not by a board, but by consensus. We called it the Dry Valley Water Stewardship Pact. And it had one rule: the lake belongs to the land, and the land belongs to those who care for it. By summer, the changes were undeniable. The cattails grew back thick on the western bank, tadpoles returned, herons nested again. The shoreline, once carved by HOA landscapers into symmetrical steps, now curved gently, soft with grass and reeds. Kids started fishing again off the public dock. One morning I walked past a boy teaching his little sister how to cast. She missed, the line tangled in a bush. He didn't yell, just smiled, reset the hook and said, "Try again, you're close." I sat there longer than I meant to. In July, the local veterans chapter hosted a picnic at the lake. They called me up in front of everyone, handed me a plaque for service to community and conservation. I don't remember what I said in return. Something about the water doing the real work. A few weeks later, the Arizona Environmental Council awarded me a certificate of honor for defending legacy hydrology and community access. That one made me laugh. Granddad would have called it bureaucratic nonsense, but I still framed it and put it in the shop, right next to his original 1946 dam permit. The lawsuit settlement came through in August. 6 figures, plus court-ordered remediation funds. I didn't keep it. I funneled every penny into a new trust, the Callahan Fund for Watershed Education. It covers scholarships now for local students studying civil engineering, conservation biology, and indigenous water rights law. The first recipient, a senior named Eliza Duran, daughter of a contractor who used to work for the HOA. She wrote her essay about how a lake taught her the difference between control and care. I cried when I read it. I still rise early most mornings, still walk the dam wall with a thermos and a dog leash. The dam's quieter now, no tension, no cameras, no HOA declarations on my gate. Just the sound of wind through cottonwood and the occasional slap of a fishtail. The town knows the story. People still talk about the day the HOA tried to shut off my water and how in the end they shut off their own. But to me it's not about revenge. It never was. It was about memory, about legacy, about the quiet power of knowing what you hold and standing your ground when someone else tries to take it. Water runs, water returns. And this lake, she remembers who kept her free. This wasn't revenge. This was justice. Revenge would have been shutting off that dam the day Cynthia smirked at my gate. Justice was letting the water tell its truth, letting their actions ripple outward until they drowned in their own lies. The Desert Glades Property Council doesn't exist anymore, disbanded, dissolved. The last entry on their website is a blank agenda dated 4 months ago. No one talks about irrigation privileges now. They talk about stewardship, about preservation, about community. Funny how fast that language changes when the law remembers its spine. I still keep a printout of the judge's ruling in my desk drawer. Not because I need it, but because it reminds me how close we came to losing something irreplaceable, not just the water, but the idea that everyday people can stand up to the ones who think paperwork equals power. And if you ask me what I'd do differently, not a damn thing. Except maybe I'd install cameras a little earlier. The lake's healthy now. The community around it is better than it ever was. The Callahan Fund grows each year, and the new Restoration Trust, run by a council of locals, scientists, and tribal reps, oversees every shoreline inch with care. We made something better than what we had before. And I think that's the real ending here. Not the courtroom, not the flood, but the rebirth that followed. Still, I know we're not done. Because while one HOA tried to claim my lake, another's trying to gate off an entire marina 3 towns over. And I heard whispers about a solar farm siphoning off water from historic ranch lines up north. You'd think they'd learn. They never do. And maybe that's why these stories matter. So now it's your turn. If you've got a story, a battle with an HOA, a moment where someone tried to take what was yours, a time when the law bent under pressure, I want to hear it. Drop it in the comments. Not for sympathy, for solidarity. Because there's more of us than there are of them. And every time we speak, we shine a little light into their backroom deals and gated agendas. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories like this. Because the next one? It's gonna involve solar panels, forged signatures, and a desert that remembers who really owns the sun. Until then, remember, water always finds its truth, and so should you.